Why do you say there's no such thing as an antagonist?
I would say that it's kind of limiting sometimes the way antagonists are spoken about in screenwriting theory. And one of those things is that someone will say, your antagonist should be personified in one person, and there should be, there could be your theme, but they're personified in one person who stops your main character from getting their goals and puts obstacles in their way. And that's the antagonist they fight at the end of the movie, and then they beat the antagonist or not at the end of the movie. Now, I've heard this said a lot, and I've heard a lot of sort of emphasis towards finding a strong antagonist. And if you can't, who's your antagonist? Like everyone will ask that, you give them a square, who's your antagonist, they'll say. And I'm like, okay, certain movies need a strong antagonist. Harry Potter's nothing without Voldemort. Luke Skywalker's nothing without Darth Vader, or maybe even Emperor Palpatine's maybe the real antagonist behind Darth Vader, but Darth Vader is probably the one that springs to mind. James Bond is nothing without Goldfinger or Dr. No or these movies are actually named after the protagonists. I mean, the antagonists like Dr. No and Goldfinger. So sometimes we need really strong antagonists with particular kind of movies. And so I think the problem that happens is if somebody says, who's your antagonist? We create antagonists out of nothing, whereas the story itself is its own unique thing, and maybe the antagonist is slightly different. And I'll explain what I mean by this, is that some movies have multiple antagonists, and some movies have what I call a tardy antagonist. It's like an antagonist who only pitches up towards the end or the middle of the movie. And those movies are kind of interesting. I do think that there's something dangerous about the dichotomy of good and bad, and protagonist and antagonist, and left wing and right wing. And I think sometimes it can result in things like Marvel movies where you have the Avengers and Thanos, he's bad. And then they try and make Thanos they give him motivations for why he's bad, but he's still clearly bad. He needs to be killed. That's what's going to happen to the antagonists. They will be destroyed. And I think that the resulting movies of this dichotomy are actually, they can be fun. Believe me, I love Star Wars and I love all these movies, but they're limiting in what they say about the human condition and what it's like to be a human. And if you look at certain movies like Rocky and The Godfather, and I mean, a lot of the movies in the top 101 movies of all time, according to the Writers Guild, have complex antagonists. When we say Rocky, the first thing people think about is Apollo Creed. He's the antagonist because he's the guy who Rocky fights at the end, right? He must be the bad guy. He's not, actually. Rocky is complex. Rocky has... Maybe the antagonist in Rocky is a little bit himself because he has a little bit of self-belief that's lacking. The antagonist is possibly poverty as well. There are other moments, and the multiple antagonist thing is in Rocky, where Paulie, who's Adrian's brother, becomes a bit of an antagonistic force at some point, and then his trainer, Mickey, also becomes a bit of an antagonistic force at some point, but they're not antagonists like Darth Vader, right? Because that's not what this movie is. So if Stallone was told, who's your antagonist? There's many, right? And Apollo Creed only appears 30 minutes into the film. He's mentioned 15 minutes in by Rocky at some point. I think he sees him on a TV or something, so he mentions Creed's great. So he's mentioned the antagonist forces is sort of mentioned there, but I think there's a problem in this notion of you must have a strong antagonist, and they must be personified in one person who puts obstacles in your hero's way to get a goal. I think it doesn't allow for the complexity, which I think some of the films that maybe didn't even go through typical development processes in the past were allowed to almost slip through. So like The Godfather, which is maybe Michael Corleone is actually the antagonist. He's like a villain protagonist. So he's kind of an interesting one. But in The Godfather, you might say, well, Sollozzo, the leader of the Turk, is the antagonist. Or maybe McCluskey, the police chief who ends up shooting his antagonist. But they all die halfway into the movie. So what is the antagonist who is the antagonist in The Godfather? There is somebody who's betrayed the family, but that question, I think the problem I have is that question is who is the main antagonist? Are they personified in a person, and can that person put obstacles in the main character's way? If you look at movies that are a little bit more nuanced in some way, and Rocky isn't even nuanced actually, they don't have that thing. And I think sometimes when writers are starting to write and they get asked this question, who's your antagonist? Are they strong enough? We end up creating antagonists, and we create good and bad in a way that I think is not that useful. And so what I would encourage people is that, sure, if you don't have forces of if everyone's just wandering around in the world, everything's happy, it's not going to work. We need to have your character needs to face challenges and obstacles and things. But I think the idea of this like strong antagonist is sometimes overwrought with some film professors or scriptwriting gurus, and they will say like, "Well, gotta have a strong protagonist." And I'll say, "Yeah, sometimes, but you can have multiple protagonists." If all those protagonists are linking to your theme of the movie in some way, it's very useful. So, for example, if you want to make a movie that's like maybe Lady Bird, where the mom is sort of the antagonist in a way in Lady Bird, but there's a lot more going on. There's the boyfriend who ends up being gay, and like, maybe I don't know if he's an antagonist, but he's certainly a struggle, and there's a real thing that she has to deal with at that point. And so it's more like there's not one big bad person in this world. And I think what's happened with even movies like the Marvel movies is they know that this is what people are feeling, so they give Thanos all this like clear motivation. But he's still pretty bad and needs to be killed. And sadly, they need to be killed in a way with violence, which I think is problematic, actually. But I think at the heart of when you set up this dichotomy of good and bad, and it goes back to Westerns, it's like, white hat, black hat. White hat needs to shoot black hat, the end. A lot of movies solve problems with violence. And of course, The Godfather's got a very violent, very, very violent ending. But it feels different to when you have a Marvel movie where how does Wonder Woman kill the guy? How does they beat she beats him up. That's basically what happens. Like all the superhero movies, they end up beating someone up or like destroying someone through violence, which means might makes right, which means the most powerful is the one that's going to win. And it results in a kind of an understanding of the world that I think is not very useful, actually. So I'll get off my high horse and preaching, but I do think there's something there. And actually some movies like Everything Everywhere All at Once was kind of interesting because she was fighting, but in the end she gave the characters who were fighting her what they wanted. I don't know if you remember, there's this fight sequence and she gives a guy a puppy or whatever, I can't remember. And like in the end she solves through violence, but it's a very interesting, it feels to me like an exploration into something slightly different, into looking at the way we are in the world, which I'd love to see more of actually in movies, is like, how can we solve our problems where it's not just one person is right and one person is wrong, but is there another way that we can communicate maybe, or tell stories that have a different dichotomy?
Well, I'm thinking of let's say something with financial justice. So if you had like Margin Call or The Big Short, I don't think I remember too much violence. Yes. There might have been a few scenes, but it was more about getting some type of justice or exposing the truth.
Yes, that is actually just so finding the justice for the antagonist is actually great. They go to prison, or they, the crime that whatever crime they've committed is met with an equal sense of justice. Maybe that's good. Maybe that is a way of doing it. Yeah, and I like that. Yeah, financial justice, or they must pay in some way, because I'm not saying everyone's going to get along and be fine. Sometimes things are just wrong, and you're like, that is terrible. You're killing all these people. Stop it. And maybe I think that's why some movies have that simple dichotomy. But anyway, my main point is that perhaps there's some freeing in thinking of your antagonists in a different way.
How do you teach your students to write an antagonist?
I think it's a difficult one, because I think really strong antagonists are often the parts of the writer's own psyche or self that they don't like, that they can, if you can do this, if you can find something that you don't like about yourself, because very often when we see something, we're like, oh my gosh, I do not like that person. It's just, they're pushing me away. Sometimes there's something in them that is actually in us, right? And so identifying that for yourself, and this is maybe the memory wall stuff as well, is like thinking like, but what am I? What are the aspects of myself that I don't like that I could put on the screen? And maybe I'm not saying writing is therapy, it really isn't, but there is a way of creating antagonists that are really great, where you can actually explore that side of yourself that you don't like in a way that's freeing and safe within the confines of writing. So I would say, that is something I would say to somebody who they're trying to create an antagonist that's really strong, is like, sure, the problem is if you just say like, well, I'm going to make them this really bad person, and you distance yourself, you end up creating these one-dimensional antagonists. But if you recognize that actually, wait a minute, there's actually something in me that I don't like, and I can experiment with that, you can create complex antagonists that way. So yeah, I would say create antagonists that are maybe not as far from you as you'd like them to be.
Sure, and I think, doesn't it take some self-awareness to realize that? Because, especially, and I hate to throw women under the bus, but a lot of times women won't like other women, and they'll say, I don't know what it is about her, I don't like her. And then what happens is problems are created for that person, but really it's probably something in them that they see, an insecurity in that person, that they go, I don't want to acknowledge that.
Absolutely.
So they take it out on the other person. I'm sure men do it too, but I think you really have to dig deep and say, why don't I like this person? Oh, you know what? I see a part of myself in her. And that's not an easy thing to do.
No, it's really not easy. I mean, I think when you asked me the question, I was almost afraid to respond because it's like, it's not easy to see that. And that's where it gets like therapy world and it gets kind of tricky. But I do think that, a lot of the times you'll see writers talk about this and they'll recognize that they see themselves in the antagonists. And I'm like, yes, this is great, because then it feels authentic and real to me. It feels like you can create something that's going to tell me something about the world, because it's not just like projecting onto this person. They're bad because they're a Nazi or something, and then you get this distance. They're bad because of something else.
Do you think it's healthy for writers to go to dark places in their material?
So it's funny that you ask me this, because meditation and TM, David Lynch talks about this all the time, because he talks about how when he was creating in the beginning, he had what he called the suffocating clown suit of negativity that he wore. And it was really draining for him and difficult. And he was depressed. He doesn't use those words, but he was really struggling. And through TM and through meditation, he kind of like got some distance from that clown suit and dropped it. He still goes to very dark places. I mean, his work for me, sometimes I can't even, it's like, oh my gosh, this is so dark. But he never attaches himself to it somehow. He would say it's through TM and through meditation, but he doesn't. So one can go to those dark places, but I do think I've seen it. If you do it in an unhealthy way, it can actually be quite dangerous for the writer. However, I do believe if we don't go to these spaces in our writing and we don't explore truth and things that we're really feeling, then we are going to write probably quite bland, generic stuff. And then the power of creation and art is not going to be what it used to be, which was to change the world in a way that's, challenging and maybe different and sharing experiences. So I do think it's okay, but I do think it does have to be done within a safe framework for the writer. It's good to know that you've got a support network. It's good to know that you're writing, you're not experiencing that. It's a little bit like child actors, actually. I have a friend who just had a movie here, Meg, and she had I think an 8 or 9-year-old kid in her movie, and quite intense things happen in the film. It's a great film, but intense things happen in it. And she worked really hard with this child actor to create a very safe space for her, so she would understand what's going on at every point. There's a man wielding an axe, but you're fine. And I know she's just like this. She's someone who's extremely nurturing and extremely amazing, and she created a safe space for this child. So I would say we have a child in us when we write as well. And if we're exposing that child to very harmful material, we need to make sure that we've created a safe space for that child to experience it. Otherwise, there may be, unintended consequences. So, I would say create a safe space for your inner child if you're going to go to those dark spaces. And whatever that is, it could be therapy, it could be friends, it could be meditation, it could be going for walks, but I think it is important. Otherwise, at what cost? At what cost are we creating? At the cost of our own mental health? Definitely we shouldn't, I don't think.
Or watching a YouTube video, I find that, as a Generation Xer, we're trained to not talk about things as much, but younger generations, it's wide open. So,
Absolutely.
Sometimes you can gain a lot from just watching a video.
Absolutely.
From someone sharing.
For sure.
And you're like, wow, I would never have the guts to do that, but wow, this is fascinating.
I know, it's amazing how that happens.
Yeah.
It's really great.
And it helps you then look at yourself,
Yeah,
if you can see someone else do it,
Yeah.
and you go, well, they're not that bad of a person, and they're struggling with something
Yeah.
similar. But that would be interesting to look at the antagonist, because they say that the antagonist doesn't, of course, think that they're the antagonist.
Yes, exactly.
They have their reasons
Never.
for what
They
they're
should
doing.
never, yeah.
And so then how important is that to show? Because, we're not doing too much backstory, because we don't want to know too much about Bob.
Yep.
But then how much are we supposed to know about, I forgot the woman that you said was in the house, and what if she's the antagonist? So we don't really know too much about her,
It's a tricky one to balance. As usual, I think with screenwriting, it's all about the balance. It's like you definitely never want to judge your antagonist. Like, especially if you're an actor playing the antagonist, this is again where it's interesting, this connection between acting and writing. If you're an actor playing the antagonist, if you're judging what you're doing, you're screwed, because you really shouldn't. You're doing what you're doing, you think what you're doing is right most of the time. Although I actually think sometimes if you know what you're doing is wrong, it's even more interesting and more compelling as a character in a way. So yeah, but I think to link up to your question, we don't want to create antagonists that we're judging as writers. That's where seeing yourself in the antagonist is good, because it's difficult to judge yourself in that same way. So.